Hi, today I want to talk about Freud. Was Freud right? I'm sure you've heard of Sigmund Freud. He's quite famous, the founder of Psychoanalysis. He was an Austrian doctor, born in Moravia in 1856, and he passed away in his 80s in 1939 in London. He had a fascinating life. He started off as a Jewish community as a doctor, and he wanted to become a professor, but was told unceremoniously that it wouldn't go his way because of anti-Semitism in Austria at the time, in the 1870s, 1880s. And so he would go into private practice as a neurologist. He would meet some interesting people, such as Joseph Breuer, for example, and it would kick off his clinical practice, and initially working as a neurologist, but then slowly coming up with some other ideas. He would experiment in hypnotism. He spent some time at Charcot in Paris training in hypnotism, and he would use it for a while, but then came up with what he called a talking cure, which is basically by free association. So if you go to a psychoanalyst or a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, you're going to be sitting or reclining on a couch with the psychoanalyst behind you, and the idea of that is to get rid of a thing called resistance. He would create his system. He'd write some very famous papers. Probably his most famous book is his dream psychology book, The Interpretation of Dreams. He had some amazing papers like Repression, 1915, Civilization as Discontents, 1927, Future of Illusion, which is about religion. I think there's late 1930s. So he's writing from the 1890s. I think the first one was Theory on Aphasia, I think it was called, around 1890. From around 1890 to 1939, he was basically writing, and he gave a lot of speeches and traveled all over the world. Probably the thing that really took off for psychoanalysis, that it was adapted very strongly by the Americans, and they created kind of pop psychology, which is a diluted version, but less diluted version we found in Europe. Psychoanalysis was very popular. Back when I was training in psychoanalysis, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I think it still had a lot of credence. Not that I ever finished my training, but I trained in psychoanalysis for a few years. So I was quite surprised lately seeing so many videos criticizing Freud, why Freud was wrong. And it's not that they're criticizing Freud, but the things they say are so hilarious that I thought I'd make a little video commenting on it. So what is so hilarious in what people are saying? Well, basically people are misunderstanding. So I'll give you an example. Back when I started in psychoanalysis, when I went to study a degree in psychoanalytic studies way back in the mid-1990s, the course director in the interview when I applied for the course, he made the point that by and large books on Freud are written by people who read other books on Freud and so on. Same like the study guides for a psychology course, you might do Freud 101 or something like that, and that study guide was probably written by a guy who read another study guide who was written by a guy who read a study guide. There's very few people that actually read the original papers and the original works of Freud, and that we would read the originals. And it's something which I think was very core to that course and very useful in life. You really got to go back and read Freud to understand. So, you know, he's not taking the kind of what we take for granted today, this modern approach of here's my theory, here's my experiences, so many people, statistics of people who came, and here's all our breakdown, analytical breakdown. That's a real sort of late 20th century, early 21st century approach. So people writing psychology books in the 1890s and early 19th century, they didn't produce any statistics. Everything is anecdotal. Now there's huge flaws, of course, in that. Scientifically, it's very weak, especially from research point of view. But when you read those books, when you read those papers, you get a lot of subtlety, and paragraph to paragraph, it's one subtle point after another subtle point after another subtle point. So they lose something compared to modern books in psychology in that they're vague and not very objective, but they have a lot of subtlety which modern psychology books don't. And you shouldn't really judge them in the same way as modern books. I mean, it's like an evolutionary biologist studying Charles Darwin. I mean, Charles Darwin had his theories, but he wrote them back in, I think, the 1850s or 60s, something like that. I mean, obviously things have moved on. So I think we have to look at people like Freud, who came up with his theories in the 1890s and the early 1900s, and realize that, you know, what are you expecting? You can't take, you know, the guy came up with a great theory. So first of all, what's the greatness of Freud is that he made psychodynamics a reality. There were some interesting guys before Freud, but nobody had a cohesive theory. And he really got a cohesive theory going, whereas before that, a lot of people were ignoring things. And you also have to understand the civilization that was around then, that, you know, late 19th century Victorian era Austria, a very repressed place. A lot of his patients were wealthy. A lot of his patients were wealthy women who tended to have a thing called hysteria. Nobody talks about hysteria anymore, but hysteria is where you get a physical symptom. So instead of worrying, your leg goes limp, for example. And it was extremely common for these ladies to have hysteria, probably because they lived in a very emotionally repressed society, a male-dominated society. And one way of getting your advice was for your leg to stop working, or to start having some funny experiences and embarrassing everybody, whereby you might, you know, speak in a different language or forget what year it was, or whatever those hysterical symptoms were. And you don't see much of it nowadays because probably we're in a less repressed society. But yeah, he started looking at what's really happening to the patient. And so there's a few big things that Freud came up with. One was his second typology, which is basically the idea that we have a conscious mind which has a superego, and we also have the unconscious mind which has an id. So you have the conscious mind, which you are now watching this video, is a conscious mind, but below the conscious mind you have the id, and the id is like the instinctual side, where all the repressed side goes, the aggressivity, the sexuality, and also things which are, you know, anything that's primordial desires, okay? And the superego then is a subpersonality, a structure, also in your subconscious mind, but the superego is the conscience, the bit that says don't be bold, don't be mad, don't be so on. In his famous work, 1927, Civilization is Discontents, he basically says that the price we pay for civilization is guilt, that the superego makes us feel guilty, because you see, you can't have people living in a society who are beating each other, beating up other people, raping people, all that sort of stuff, being aggressive, and so we tend to repress. Now, I think pretty much everybody, or nearly everybody, in medical sciences would tend to agree that they now call the superego the inner critic, by and large, and that we do seem to have some kind of unconscious or subconscious mind, or some other part of the mind where memories and feelings go, and belief systems, and that obviously we have an instinctual side. It's well-proven fact in psychology that we have a fight or flight instinct, that we either want to beat somebody up or we want to run away, which basically is a proof of the id. So I think a lot of people do still agree with this. And we can also add another layer of complexity, which is basically not just aggressive thoughts and not just sexual thoughts, but also inappropriate thoughts. Because remember, we're living in a complex society, and often we're thinking thoughts and the feelings which go with those thoughts, which are at odds with the society we live in. So we might feel that our boss did something that we don't agree with, or our family member did something we don't like, or the government or whoever. And so these are also repressed. These thoughts are also repressed because they're inconvenient truths. They're things that we don't want. We don't want to be cancelled, basically. So we have this official thing now, people being cancelled over all sorts of things. But even 100 years ago, people were getting cancelled left, right, and centre for thinking or saying the inappropriate things. So we're repressing aggressivity, we're repressing sexuality, we're also all those naughty thoughts where we really want to tell the boss, we want to tell our wife, and so on. We're repressing those things too. Another great achievement of Freud would be The Interpretation of Dreams, which is a fantastic book that goes through a lot of theory. And his basic proposal is that the dream is a wish fulfillment. And why is the dream a wish fulfillment? What he's basically saying is that our superego is repressing. And as thoughts go up, there's a kind of a barrier, a preconscious barrier, and we try and keep repressing these inappropriate thoughts. But those thoughts seem to have their own kind of life, their own libido. And one of the challenges with Freud is that the word libido is thrown around a lot, and we tend to think of libido as sex, but actually really means drives. And so your repressed thoughts, your aggressive thoughts, your sexual thoughts, and your appropriate thoughts, they don't just have it's not a sex drive, but they actually have an energetic drive to be heard, to be seen, to be fulfilled. And so these aspects of yourself, which are not allowed out, are trying to fulfill themselves. And what they do is they'll grab an innocent thought, an innocent image in the dream, and they'll jump on top of it. That's why you might have, for example, you might have a dream whereby your uncle is a guy with a beard, you love your uncle, but you're talking to your uncle and he's spitting at you. And you don't understand, why is my uncle spitting? But actually, the spitting was somebody else that you don't like was spitting at you. Okay, and that was that day, somebody was spitting at you, they spoke and kind of spit came out, you don't like them. But then you see your uncle. So you're trying to, that thought or judgment or feeling about that person is trying to come up, but it's swapped out with your uncle so that it will have approval, so the thought's trying to get by you. Now, you could argue, is that 100% accurate? Maybe yes, maybe no, but you go off yourself and read the interpretation of dreams. I think a lot of it, anecdotally, you see, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's certainly, he was more right than wrong in his dream, understanding of dreams. And he calls the dreams the railroad of the unconscious, because it will bring you, if you observe dreams, this is a big part of psychoanalysis. There's two things. One is simply going and sitting with a psychoanalyst who is sitting behind you and free associating and just whatever you're talking about. And the second thing is looking at dreams and trying to see patterns. And forget the dream interpretation books you might have seen. You have to look at your interpretations, okay? Within the dream, okay? The other great thing there, getting back to the actual psychotherapy, and this is a great strength again with psychoanalysis, is there is a very strong emphasis on resistance and removing resistance. And the idea is that very quickly the analysand, as they call it, which you call the patient, or you call the client, in the modern day vernacular we call a client, those days they call it patient. So the analyst and the analysand. The analysand will start having transference with the analyst, and it could be good, it could be bad. You might be a sexual attraction, might be a feeling that they're like your brother or your sister or something, might be repulsion to remind you of your dad or your mom, your auntie, and so on. So different transferences go through. The idea is that the analyst will try and say nothing, the person will just keep speaking. Because the analyst isn't saying anything or saying very, very little, the analysand is more prone to just letting things out now, out of frustration, then trying to think, who is this person? I think that's a very clever thing, because like, why aren't you listening to me? Why aren't you talking? Who are you? And then you can ask yourself, well, who is this? Who is the person you're looking for approval from, or you're looking for an answer from, and so on. So it's a clever system, because the other most popular system of psychotherapy will be humanistic psychotherapy, and that's where you sit facing the therapist, and the therapist might be very, I hear your problem, and this is what you're going to do about it. But the problem with that, from a Freudian point of view, I think this is very clever, is that the patient, the person who goes for the treatment, they'll probably want to trick you, because they don't want you to know the truth. And not only they don't want you to know the truth, they themselves don't want to know the truth. So there's an inclination that they will probably go and trick you in some way, or trick themselves. And so a therapist sitting there saying, I know what your problem is. Yeah, you know my problem. You can go around in circles, and this is the big problem with what's called the defense mechanisms. A big problem is that there's a tendency to, you'll agree with your therapist, and they'll agree with you, and nothing will happen, because the defense is still there. The defense is simply there as different forms of resistance to try and con you into not dealing with that which you really need to deal with, which would actually change your life if you could face it. So the big thing with how the subconscious mind or unconscious mind, as Freud would call it, works, is that it will do things that make sense in the moment. So your mind might take a position, a defensive position, when you're 6 years of age, and it works when you're 6, but it doesn't work when you're 26. And another very practical example of this, which is more outside the realms of psychotherapy, more in the realms of behavioral therapy really, is that person will develop a phobia, and often the person will, as a way of coping, they will have a phobia. But that phobia doesn't work. Like if you've got a phobia of airplanes, for example, it's not very practical. And maybe that in some way, that phobia is helping you when you're 5 years of age over some issue. But it causes problems later, okay? Like a lot of us, for example, and we're going more into psychotherapy now at this level, a lot of us will have issues with an inability to speak our voice, to stand up and ask that important person for a date, to push ourselves forward in an interview and so on and so forth, and progress our life. But maybe when we were a young child, we embarrassed ourselves, and so we had the thought, I'll never do that again. I don't want to embarrass myself again. And so that will become a strong thought. But that strong thought, I don't want to be embarrassed, means I'm not going to avoid situations where I have to speak in public, for example, or where I have to talk to people and ask for that sale or ask for that, a relational chance romantically. That holds us back in life. So really, the best thing we could possibly do in life is actually just go ahead and do it. Many years ago, I remember being in a nightclub in Ireland, seeing a bunch of these African guys, and they just asked one girl for a dance. She ignores them. Next girl. And Irish guys wouldn't do that. Irish guys just spend the whole night to ask one girl and then just leave it. And I think these African guys had a better approach. Just go for it. In life, who dares wins. The person who asks for more sales gets more sales. The person who asks for more dates gets more dates. The person who applies to more interviews gets more jobs. So daringness is good, but most of us have that scared out of us somewhere early in life. So these are all things which are good. I can go into a lot more detail. I prefer not to right now because it would make a very long video. But what is the major criticism of Freud? And the major criticism, I think, would probably be the Oedipus complex. Because the Oedipus complex basically says that there is stages of development, which is the oral, anal, and phallic. Which again, I would tend to agree with. I think so, but a lot of people now would think, oh, that sounds terrible. How could that possibly be? Basically that we start engaging with the world via our mouth when we're a very small baby. Then we learn how to control our bowels, and then we become somewhat sexual. Freud would suggest by 5 or 6 years of age, we've reached this peak of sexuality, and then it goes into a dormancy phase, or latency phase, and we'll come back out again when we are in our adolescence. And a very big part of this, and we can talk a lot about oral and anal, that's also very interesting. And a lot of people criticize those two. I won't go into detail now, but I think they're actually very interesting. So for example, why is it that things like eating too much food, smoking, drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, etc., why are these things addictive and hard to deal with, and hard to get rid of? Because they're oral fixations. And that's the first thing you do, is use your mouth. And any addiction regarding the mouth is going to be difficult to get rid of. And that makes a lot of anecdotal sense, although I can't prove it scientifically. So the Oedipus complex basically says that the young boy is attracted to the mom, he would like to have sex with the mom, at some stage realizes dad in the way, and that he starts fearing the dad, and that he will be castrated, okay? The girl will have an electric complex where she will be attracted to the father instead of the mother, and but then somewhere along the way she realizes she's already been castrated. If you start thinking in terms of the penis, in terms of the vagina, and it looks like it's castrated in some ways. And a lot of people have issues with that, and especially that seems to be so pro heteronormative sexual development. And I can't stand here and 100% stand by Oedipus complex, because it's such a stretch from the point of view of, objective proof. And there's so many variables in human sexuality. But there's something to it. But I think if you just take it purely as Freud read it out, as he wrote it, as he spoke it, and as he discussed it, it won't really stand in today's society. For a start, for people who are gay or trans or anything like that, it basically says you're just screwed. You just your Oedipus complex didn't go well, and that's why you're in the state you're in, which probably doesn't fully explain why they are the way they are, and doesn't really help them, and probably push them to the outside a bit. But also, it's so normative. But you have to understand that it's society in those days was somewhat restrictive, and it's a bit of a stretch thinking that every boy fancies his mom and every girl fancies her dad, and it's so simplistic. So what I would just add here is that if you go deeper into, say, post-Freudianism, I think you'll start seeing things which are very interesting. And this is where I feel most people who are detractors of Freud are getting it wrong. Is they're not reading Freud, the original Freud, and they're also not reading or watching the post-Freudians, because the post-Freudians add a lot of interesting things. So just to keep the video short, I'll just add two people very quickly. One is Melanie Klein. She was a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. She died many years ago, probably 1950s, 60s, around that time. And she came up with the object relations school of psychoanalysis. She's mainly focused in child psychotherapy. And she would suggest that the child is born in a schizoid state, whereby things are outside or inside. And they're very aggressive and very selfish. And by 18 months, they move from what's called a paranoid schizoid phase, whereby she uses words like the good breast and the bad breast, and desire to bite the breast and all that stuff. And then they move to a depressive position. Not that they're depressed, but the depressive position basically means that the young child starts to feel guilty that maybe I'm hurting the mom. Usually the idea is that part of her theory is that the mom is the world of the small child, and that at that stage then the child will start having personality integration. We can think of the Mobius strip, and that's this, you might have had it in maths class, this kind of piece of card that goes kind of in and out and it has no beginning or end. And so when we move from schizoid to depressive position, we actually move into this integration where there's an outer and an inner and complexity. And one observable thing with people who are having as schizophrenic episodes, because a lot of people who are, say, schizophrenics, they're not always out of reality. They're a lot of the time they're fine, but then you have episodes where they're out. And then there's some people who are schizophrenics who are out all the time, pretty much. But either way, I mean, Freud would say that a madman is a man who is dreaming, that he's dreaming while awake. Carl Gustav Jung would say the symptoms of a person who is a mental illness, like schizophrenic, is basically their symptoms is an effort at a cure, an effort to recreate their world. And so both Freud and Carl Gustav Jung would say that the mental illness is, the symptoms of mental illness is an effort to integrate or get back to that state. And if we look at now more of an objective point of view, if you objectively look and research at people who are in a very schizophrenic phase, and they mightn't be always like this, by the way, there's a tendency to take things literally, to think that things are outside or inside, things are this way or that way, and so they have a schizoid kind of personality at that time, and they take things very literally. The metaphor is kind of missing. I could also push it further and say that we're living in a schizoid society. That our society is not in a depressive position. Our society is basically a schizoid society. We're basically a mad society. Our society is not integrated at all. I think that, that Melanie Klein viewpoint, again, I can't prove it scientifically, this is weakness psychotherapy, but it makes a lot of sense. Now, another person I'd add to this is, which I mentioned before, and I mentioned again because it's very useful, is Jacques Lacan, who's a French psychoanalyst. Again, he passed away probably in the 1980s, I think. And he came with a lot of interesting ideas, and he described what he calls, he's a structuralist, so he thinks the world in these structural formats and linguistics. So he would describe that we have a thing called the real, which is the world, the universe around us, but we can't deal with the real. So it's like, in the electromagnetic spectrum, we're seeing a tiny little bit, but the spectrum is very big. So in other words, all this reality is around us. Neutrinos are going through us, radio waves are going through us, all sorts of things are happening, but we're not perceiving them. And he would say if you could perceive this real, it just blow your mind. You can't deal with it anyway. So the only thing that's going to make sense is the symbolic order. And symbolic order is civilization, society, symbolic elements in society that give structure to the mind and that we all buy into as a civilization, and that creates language. Language is a structure. Without language, we wouldn't have this organized, rational mind that we have. It requires language. And so he would say that Oedipus complex is real, but it's more like the symbolic order or going into symbolic order. So if you start looking at As Melanie Klein, you start realizing that there's need for integration of personality, and that we can regress. Either a civilization can regress, or a person can regress. So if we look at things like witch burnings and stuff like that, that's a regressive society. And when the society becomes very regressed, like the people doing all the witch burnings years ago, so people were, back in the medieval era, people were very emotionally oppressed. You know, they kept thinking about death. They didn't have any money. There was no idea of money. They weren't supposed to have sex or enjoy sex. And so they probably enjoyed torturing witches. It was probably a lot of fun. When you're an incredibly repressed person, there would be this big drama. You can get your aggression out and you hurt the person, and you can all burn the person and whoo, we've done our bit. So Afghanistan, when the Taliban came in, the same kind of, these guys are also in that kind of primordial. You see a society that has regressed a lot, has gone back into a very, I said earlier, we're a schizoid society. In a very broad sense, their society's not integrated. But if you go deep into it, you can get these very tyrannical, scary kind of civilizations whereby you do something wrong, they chop your head off and they torture you and do terrible things to you. These are societies that, from a psychoanalytic point of view, would be societies which are very disintegrated, non-integration, and there's a tendency to go back towards the primordial. Whereas everything that creates civilization for us and makes us civilized comes with this complexity of things like repression and so on and so forth. So if we look at what Lacan is saying here, is basically that the Oedipus complex is more than, you know, I fancy my mom, or girl, I fancy my dad, or the penis. It's more like the penis is the phallus, and the phallus is representing the integration of society, the alignment of the personality with a symbolic order. And that's more important. And when you start looking at that, then it allows the gay, trans, and everybody else to, oh, right, okay, this makes a lot of sense. We're integrating into this bigger something. And it's about fitting in and finding a place within that structural thing of a complex society. So, to finish up, I just feel that people who are criticizing Freud have very simplistic notions, and often they're very hurt and offended by anything that would threaten their idea of gender, or anything that would threaten their idea of, you know, the sacredness of the relationship between the parent and the child, which they would feel is offensive to them. And, you know, a very superficial reading of Freud, a very superficial reading of human nature. And, you know, so my advice to you is to go back and read the original Freud, and also read the post-Freudians, because they're building upon the work of Freud. Freud was a man of his time. He died in 1939. But what I personally find very interesting, is one of the reasons why I have this channel, one reason why I make these videos about Freud, for example, is that there's a beauty in psychoanalysis, especially less so as a psychotherapy, because there's been research done on psychoanalysis suggesting that it's very unlikely that seems to make people any better than just regular. You know, you spend 5 years in psychoanalysis, you're probably going to be no more mature than just 5 years in normal life. Objectively, it can't be proven that does anything. Although a lot of people go to psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and feel that it has done something, but it's hard to prove what's done for them. So where I feel is stronger, okay, so the psychoanalytic therapy is very subjective, but psychoanalytic theory is a fantastic philosophical tool. I'm not sure if Freud would be happy with that being a doctor and trying to prove it. You know, it was always rolled out some scientific, but there's never any scientific proof. Whereas the statistics and the analysis, it's never there. It's all anecdotal. But as a philosophical tool, it's a great way of analyzing and thinking about the world. And it's something that I've taken away from psychoanalysis, the way of looking at the world. Now, of course, we have to realize when we're looking at any kind of philosophy, and that's what psychoanalysis really is. It's a philosophy, an approach, but it's a practical philosophy. It's a philosophical paradigm and methodology that allows you to look at different aspects of life, like this is your own personality, cultural issues, literary issues, history. You can use psychoanalytic theory and look at all of these things in a very interesting way. Now, it's not scientific, but it can be logically consistent. Just like any philosophy is never scientific, you can't prove philosophy, but it can be logically consistent. And there are many schools of psychoanalysis and different viewpoints, but as long as you realize when you're using psychoanalysis that, you know, it's not necessarily the truth either. It's just a tool, and it's a very useful tool. And there's a beauty in that tool that allows you to have a more subtle and nuanced ways of thinking about the world. I'm not saying it's the only tool or the only methodology or the only philosophical approach, but it's a very one of the more useful ones. And I think that's very useful because the only way we can progress as a civilization is to develop a deeper discourse that moves away from our present polarities, because we're in this very schizized society where there's a bunch of people over here hating a bunch of people over there, and everybody's fighting each other and projecting and in denial of various things, and so we're not at all integrated. I'm not saying that we should have one truth or we would have some viewpoint, but we can all work towards more personal integration, and society can work towards more integration in society, whereby we work towards a situation whereby we can have different ideas but not be offended that somebody else has a different idea, and be able to, see what I think and what I observe. My belief system's over here and my observance over here. I can believe something and I see it for what it is. I realize it's a belief. And I see observation, I see that for what it is, I see it as an observation. I don't necessarily have to judge the crap out of myself or other people. So there's a lot we can do to become more integrated without, I'm saying, becoming all kind of dominated by one viewpoint. And psychoanalysis is one of those tools, not the only tool, but one of those very useful tools that you can kind of throw it into any discipline and use it as a way of analyzing and thinking about the subject in a deeper way. And I really feel that the only way we can really move ahead as a society is to develop deeper levels of discourse, which allows us to understand in a more subtle way and go deeper into understanding reality. Because I think a lot of what we're doing a lot of the time is living at this very superficial level. So we need to be able to go and have a language. And psychoanalysis is one of those things that creates a language that allows us to go in at a deeper level. And I think that's very, very important. And it's the beauty of psychoanalysis. And for anybody who's been reading watching those videos about Freud's rubbish stuff, those people by and large have not read the original Freud, have not looked at the post-Freudians, and aren't getting the big picture that, wow, this is a useful tool, philosophical approach, didactical, technical tool that I can use in a different settings to analyze different disciplines, not necessarily coming up with an objective truth, but just having different ways of looking at things that might create interesting ideas, viewpoints, perspectives that might be useful. And like these things are always limited, they're never 100% provable, but useful tools. And I would see psychoanalysis, the beauty of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory is it gives a wonderfully complex, though not provable, viewpoint of the world that allows us to analyze and look at every aspect of human existence and go a little deeper into it. So as a tool, it's a very wonderful thing. So was Sigmund Freud right? Of course, he wasn't 100% right. He was right about the big things, and he was not right about many things. But he was, the really great thing was that he's the first guy to make psychotherapy a thing, and also to go beyond a lot of taboos and get people to start thinking about and talking about stuff that people don't like thinking about and people don't like talking about, but it's necessary, because if we want to have a civilization, we have to look at the underbelly and integrate. Okay, hope you liked the video. Please like and subscribe if you do, and I'll talk to you next time.